Yeah, how's everybody? Good, good. I don't know if I want to take credit for bringing Albert to the place where he is today. So, what you were listening to was a network of people who have, and institutions and representatives of institutions who responded to a National Science Foundation RFP to broaden participation in STEM. And the institutions were brought together by the Algebra Project, the Young People's Project, and CEP, the Southern Initiative Algebra Project, which had been working together for close to maybe 2.5 decades on the issue of bottom quartile math literacy. And so what I would like to do is put that effort into a larger constitutional framework. And as you know, the whole country, I'm getting feedback. As you know, the whole country is going through a constitutional crisis. And it's a good thing to turn our attention to the Constitution. And let me do it by just telling you a very short story. In the spring of 1963, SNCC field secretaries Jimmy Travis, myself, and Randolph Blackwell from the Voter Education Project were grease-gunned on the highway, leaving Greenwood, trying to get to Greenville. And as a result, we called all of the SNCC field secretaries together to converge on Greenwood. And we raised money for food because they had cut out the federal allotment, and basically straight up told the sharecroppers, the reason you don't have the federal allotments is because of politics. And so if you want this food, you have to be ready to go down and register to vote. So hundreds went down, and they arrested the SNCC field secretaries, the Greenwood authorities. So at that time, Kennedy was alive. He was president. Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General. Burke Marshall was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He filed suit against the city and had our cases removed to the Federal District Court in Greenville and sent John Doerr to be our lawyer. We bust over sharecroppers and filled the courtroom. And I was on the witness stand. Federal District Judge Clayton had just one question. He asked me, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So sharecropper illiteracy was the subtext of the right to vote. And basically we said, well, the country can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't have denied a whole people access to literacy through its politics and then turn around and say, well, you can't do politics because you're illiterate. Now, if you think about that courtroom scene, there are three different constitutional actors in that scene. There's the judge who is representing the judiciary and the federal government, part of the federal government. But in this case, really acting on behalf of the state of Mississippi, which has its legal representation in court. And then there's John Doerr representing the Justice Department and the feds directly. And then there are the SNCC field secretaries and all of the sharecroppers sitting in the bench, really from the constitutional point of view, representing the outreach of the preamble, right? The we the people. Who are the we the people in this country, and what impact do they have as citizens of the country? Because the thing to think about is that the snake field secretaries and the sharecroppers, they were there in that courtroom not thinking, oh, we are citizens of Mississippi, woe is us. They were thinking we are citizens of the nation and it means something, right? And so the force, which is lacking still now in this country, is the we the people force, the preamble force, the force which started this country, the idea that the people themselves could come together and ordain and establish a constitution and a government based on that constitution. So we are in this period where there's a question of whether or not the government really can work or not. And we have formed an alliance around this issue, which is in some senses more difficult to work on in that there's so many more players than the right to vote, right? The right to vote kind of presented itself first very clearly as there's a we the people force that's demanding this right. Then there's a state action which is saying you don't have the right to do what you're doing. And then there's the federal government. First, just the Justice Department and the executive branch. But then after Medgar Evers was murdered in June of 1963, and we shifted our tactics really to look at the political side of this, the national parties and the national party structures, by running candidates for office for the Senate, for the Congress, and for governor and lieutenant governor. We focused on, and to our surprise, found the key that unlocked Mississippi in the National Democratic Party structure, right? And that was the Fannie Lou Hamer group of Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that went to the 1964 convention, right? And opened up, in some sense, the levees that were keeping out Black people and other minorities from the National Democratic Party structure. So that was a big surprise that the key to Mississippi lay not in the government per se, right? The executive or the judicial or the legislative branch, but actually in the party structure, in the National Democratic Party structure, which then forced those other branches to come to the table. So today, we are involved in this math literacy. One way to think about it, of course, is that the right to vote presented itself as an organizing tool in the 20th century because of the politics planet-wide of the 20th century, when colonial peoples all across the planet were demanding a political voice. And after World War II, that movement came to this country. And that's what happened in this country. African Americans, as a kind of internal colony, demanded actual representation and a political voice. So what's going on across the planet in our times now, of course, is the shift from the industrial to the information age technologies. And this has brought about an opening for literacy program, because in the 20th century, it was only reading and writing literacies. That judge was not thinking about quantitative literacy and mathematics. He was just thinking about illiterate sharecroppers who couldn't read and write. But the situation now with the information technology age dawning upon us, there is a new literacy, which is quantitative literacy. And with this new literacy comes also a new kind of work, right? So with the technology of the 20th century, it was factory work. And with the technology of this century now, it's knowledge work. So I think of what the judge was talking about when he says, why are you taking all these illiterates? He was talking about the underlying, what I call sharecropper education, which was prevalent and still exists in this country. At that time, it was a sharecropper education for African Americans across the Black Belt that said, look, there's only a certain kind of work that's available to you. And so therefore you get at best a minimal education that prepares you in some sense for that work. I think the country as a whole is now caught up in a political crisis, and underneath all of it is the refusal of the country to retool its education for the information age. And so we are dealing with sharecropper education all across the country for maybe 80% or more of the population who have gone to school and been prepared to do in school the work of the 20th century, but have not really been prepared to do knowledge work, which has a quantitative literacy dimension to it, right? And so with this alliance, which really takes off on the history of the Mississippi theater of the Civil Rights Movement, we have been trying to develop ways to address this issue with math, and more recently with Cliff. Cliff Freeman is there. Has he been introduced to everybody yet? Has Cliff been introduced?
Not yet.
Okay. So let me just give a short introduction, because Cliff is going to be facilitating the conversation Q&A. And I think I'm about the end of what I needed to say in just talking to you. Cliff has grown up from, I guess, maybe 10th or 11th grade in high school as part of the Young People's Project, and went on to get his BA and MA at Wentworth Institute for Technology in Boston, but didn't do what most young people his age, and especially African Americans, might do with that education, which is, seek a big paying job working for Google or Amazon or someplace like that. He instead joined in this work, which is at its essence the work of the preamble. How is it we establish the idea that national citizenship means something, and how do we make it mean something for education? So I'm going to turn you over to Cliff for a second and then come back. Hello?
I didn't know he was going to do that. So I still a little bit that I'm doing. And so, in a nutshell, how Bob frames it. It was in 2015 when, yeah, it was in 2015, Bob called me, which he wasn't supposed to at the time. He was in the hospital. I hope I can share this story, Bob. And he was in the hospital, and I guess that was a project in YPP. They got a grant to do some work with computers. And this was around my birthday. I think it was like my birthday. And Bob called, he said, Cliff, and I know everyone knows who's in the YPP. Bob was on the phone at this period of time. And in the background, I hear, Mr. Moses, you cannot be on the phone. You cannot be on the phone. I'm like, oh, you can't get the phone. So he said, oh, Cliff, we have this thing coming up, this project with computers, and I think you should work on it. And if you get to know Bob, or if you know Bob, you can't say no to it. Because one, he's usually right about, he has a very good sense of what he's saying, and so that's why not. So since 2015, I've been working with Young People's Project to hammer out the problem of computer science, how computer science, math literacy, and Black people relate to one another. And that if we will survive and thrive in the 21st century, these three things must be entangled. So last year we started a model where I hired college students in the local area to help me with computer science instruction. You probably all know that in your districts, computer science is probably like trying to look for a dinosaur. It's barely there. You probably dig for it. But so the computer science is there. So our model brings in college students for that near-peer approach for the high school students. And the really big kickback is that high school students will then go to middle and elementary school students to teach them computer science and math integrated that we've taught them for about half a year. So last year we had 20 students, and we probably did boot camps, or we did 13 boot camps at our schools. And this 20 ninth graders, they designed and perfected their boot camps. And they taught 1,500 students in their immediate community in Boston. So I think that is incredible, considering that's incredible, considering the people, the quote-unquote shared private education Bob talked about, that was the destiny for these students. There's a young lady in the crowd, she went to Excel High School, she talked about it yesterday. And it is true that Excel High is the turnaround status, and this school is, they're giving all the stereotypes about these students will not make it. And these students here are taking on the latest and greatest, and I think everyone here might think most rigorous work, and they're teaching other people flawlessly and easily. Because with a little bit of practice, it is, they're up to. So we expanded the model, and the access for computer science and math is growing just in that little pocket. So we've been talking about how there's bright spots all over the country, and it's so hard to just have the system figure out, hey, look all the bright spots, let's do it. So I assume that's what Bob wanted me to say. He's currently on the phone. He's my Android, I'm moving in this stuff. But so what we are going to do now was a Q&A session. But so at 3, if you want to continue in this dialogue and learn a little bit more about how computer Black people opt to relate. I will be running a session. I think we're going to be in the chapel, the open space, and we're going to do an activity called human programming. I created a program for us to all take a survey in, and it's going to spit out your career for the rest of your life. It's on just 3 variables that you're populate most, and how young people need to understand how to not just be on the opposite end of algorithms where they're getting outputs, but that they are the creators and the developers of it. Because they are devastating. You should know. Hopefully, come to the question. It's still not bad. We need to talk.
Yes, on one with who?
So I tell them all about everything. And they're queuing up. They don't look like it, but they're queuing up for a Q&A session. We have 45, so we have 15 minutes. So we can just come up 1, 2, 3 at a time, and I'll have a mic here. And then you can just speak loud, and while we're filming in the crowd, probably try to answer.
And can you hear me, Cliff?
Yeah.
So we had a delivery here at this apartment because the dryer had to be changed. So excuse me 1 minute. I have to talk to them and I'll be right back. The owner, Did you guys call the owner? Or? I have to call.
So we should set up a queue line, maybe 3 at a time. We should set up a queue. So this one, if there's less than 3 people, 1 person. So that we're ready to drive people.
Okay, sorry about that, folks.
All right, guys. Can you hear me? Can you hear us?
No, I didn't hear the question.
Can you hear us good? Can you hear us really good?
Yes, I can hear you. There's a little echo there.
Okay. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us this morning. Oh, I'm not technologically minded. Thank you so much for speaking with us this morning. I'm a teacher in Brooklyn, New York, elementary school, and what I struggle with is, in terms of math instruction, is like a test-based curriculum, teaching to the test. And I know your work is with, I'm imagining your work is mostly with high school students, or is it all ages? It's all ages. I'm just curious what your actual work looks like, and how you deal with, you know, the testing culture in our country and the test-based curriculum, math curriculum that is pushed onto our schools and our teachers.
So the best thing is, and tell me your name, ma'am.
Oh, sorry. My name is Katie Lapo. I'm
Katie.
Brooklyn.
Katie, is that right? Okay. So what I would like, Katie, to happen is for Albert and Cliff to work to put you in touch with a group of a network in Ohio. We had a an NSF grant that we ran for 5 years following a cohort of high school students through. And they did so well that some of the superintendents decided they needed to transfer the pedagogy, the process of teaching and learning down to the elementary school. And so for the past 3 or 4 years, they have been working at the elementary schools, and they have a network of about 6 or 7 school districts in and around Mansfield, Ohio. And in particular, they've been following a process to develop across several grade levels the increasing sophistication of the students' concept of fractions and rational numbers by having them make their own rulers, right? And they actually have teacher developed materials dealing with fractions and what students need to know in the elementary school years. And so that would, I think, on the one hand, really give you a direct contact with people who've been wrestling with your problem about, well, what do we do about the tests and so forth, right? On the other hand, in New York, Kate Bellin is a math teacher at the Fannie Lou Hamer School in the Bronx. And they're involved in putting together a network that might, will consider whether or not or how they might join this alliance, right? And so Cliff and Albert can put you in touch with her for what's going on in New York around this issue with us. And then, and of course, Fannie Lou Hamer School is a high school which does not do state testing, right? So there, I don't know if the movement, you know, to opt out of state testing has reached elementary schools, right? But there are a network of in New York City which do not do state testing.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, yeah.
Well, my name is Daniel, and I was intrigued by your comment about the country's refusal to retool the education system for the information age. And I struggle often with the entrance exam for college admissions. The requirements for admission to colleges tend to really be the tail of the dog in terms of whether we have advanced algebra, junior high, middle school, and how do we change the vernacular? We have high-tech high in all the schools in the country that are trying to reframe what we're trying to do in terms of curriculum. And math in particular becomes a very politicized entity with regard to you must take this in order to get to the college. So I'm curious about how do we reframe this, all of this education for the information age.
So the question, don't go away. So the question is about reframing.
Well, you made the statement about we have failed to really refuse as a country to retool education for the information age. And I think that we really are succumbing to the college entrance exam as being the basic premise of how we frame our educational system down to kindergarten. And wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, so here's the issue, right? Are you familiar with James Bryan Conant?
I'm not.
So he was president of Harvard from 1933 till 1953. And he became president because of the Depression, because Harvard then decided it needed to change the nature of its leadership. And so he was a chemistry professor, right? He wasn't part of the elite network that had been running Harvard and other institutions. And he took a look around and decided that he wanted to make it possible for public school students to go to Harvard. And so he was the one that got his dean, Henry Chauncey, and they looked at various tests and finally decided on using the SAT as a test for Harvard National Scholars, right? And so across the 1930s, the SAT was used by the Ivy League schools for scholarship students from public schools. And it was the only way that they could test them because the traditional tests up to then had been the curriculum of the private schools, right? So then after World War II, Conant established ETS, the Educational Testing Service, and set up the country's quote unquote meritocracy. So what we have in place are a system in which we learned how to measure certain things in the 20th century. And so we have an education system which values what we can measure, right? And so that's the problem Katie just raised, teaching to the test, right? Which really becomes the driver of the education, particularly for the kids that we are concerned with at the bottom, right? So we need to flip that. We need to decide what we value, and then we need to learn different ways to measure what we value, right? So now the Fannie Lou Hamer School in New York and the network of schools that they are part of, right, has begun to do that, right? They decide what they value about the teaching and learning that goes on in the school, and then they figure out different ways to measure it, right? And then their kids move on. So then the question is, of course, what happens to the kids when they get to college? And there is some data about what happens because they run into the standardized tests again. But we need, again, we need at the college level the same conversation, right? What do we really value? And how do we measure what we value? Because the kids who come out may be able to measure up to standard on doing that, right? So we need to move in that direction, but to move in that direction, we need the federal government to actually take its responsibility for the education of the children all across the country. President Grant, in his 1875 State of the Union address, asked Congress for a constitutional amendment to allow the federal government to get involved in the education of the children of the country. That didn't happen. Conant, the architect of the nation's meritocracy, after he left Harvard, decided to take a look at public schools and published a book that everyone should read. It's called Slums and Suburbs, and he published it in 1961. James Bryan Conant, Slums and Suburbs. And in that book, he references Grant. He says, well, we didn't get a constitutional amendment. What happened to the freed slaves was that we constructed a very tight caste system. And what we have come to understand, to our chagrin and belatedly, is that the clearest manifestation of the caste system is our education system. So he's saying that after the Civil War, for 3/4 of a century, the country really ran an education system which was driven by a caste system. So to overcome that, and this is the central question the country has had difficulty with, and it's having it now with undocumented immigrants as well as African Americans, as well as all those people incarcerated through these phony drug charges, right? Who are the citizens of the country, and what does it mean to be a citizen of the country? So the alliance that we're involved in is beginning to make an effort at a legislative initiative. We are in touch with some Congress people, and we're trying to figure out how to put something on the table that is a federal initiative aimed at the bottom quartile and their math literacy. Admittedly, this is just a tiny piece of the big problem, but it's a piece around which we might be able to get some traction.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
What's your name?
My name is Angela.
Angela?
Yes, my name is Angela.
Okay.
My question is about STEAM. So I came to your work and knowledge about you through YPP in Michigan when it was at Ann Arbor. And I value the conversation about preparing young people for their future and like what careers mean in that regards. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on art in this conversation and the space that various forms of art give for developing critical thinking and like a deep sense of understanding of self, which I think is also very important in this conversation of preparation for life beyond school.
So I just got an email from Philip Agnew and his partner Aja on the role of art and the whole democratic society. It's a TED Talk, right? And it would be great for you to look at that, right? So I can forward that to Cliff and Albert, and then they can forward it to you, right? So it's a TED Talk about using art as a fundamental lever for a democratic society and for a basis for insurgencies that are needed in the country. So I agree with the idea that art is really important. And when we started doing the algebra project in the middle schools in the 1990s, and we had the kids take a trip to get them ready for a unit, which was called the Trip Line. We actually recruited artists to go with the students. In some cases, there was such a person in the school, but we asked them to construct a mural based on their trip, right? so that art became a vehicle for actually thinking about the underlying fundamental concepts of math. Because certainly in some sense, art and math pay attention to the most obvious features of our life and try to figure out how to represent them in one way or another. So they have a very deep connection in that sense. I don't know if that helps with your question.
I think my question is more of a conversation, but thank you.
This is not. So if you identify yourself as a young person, we would love to hear your question. But it's not a, if you don't have a question, that's okay. But we're encouraging you. Don't let the old folks take the space. Hold on. I just asked you to clarify the name of the TED person. Oh, I can do it there. That's the dream. All right.
Good morning, Mr. Moses. It's quite an honor to be able to talk to you. You do some amazing work. My name is Dave. I'm a high school social studies teacher in Chicago. My question is, first, are you aware of any teachers in Chicago who are using your work and your philosophies? And secondly, what can I do as a social studies teacher to help encourage math teachers to incorporate your work? And also, like in my social studies classroom, how can I also best incorporate math into my curriculum that also ties into social justice and bringing about systemic changes?
So we're in touch with some people in Chicago. We were in Chicago back in the 1990s when you had community control of different schools and school districts. And when the mayor took over, we were pushed out. But there is a group in Chicago, and we can get you their names. What happened with the NSF broadening participation in STEM was they funded about 70 different groups across the country in 2016 and 2017. And there is a group in Chicago that was funded. And they are working on the social justice end of the thing also. I guess Cliff, we can put him in touch with BJ. And BJ Walker lives in Chicago and is a part of this network. And I think it's her niece who is running this group in a section of Chicago that got funded and is doing work on this issue right now. That's probably the best contact to make. There are some other contacts that you can discuss with Albert in terms of the work going on at pre-service. There's some work going on there. And my son, Omowale, has some people in Chicago who are working on that. And then YPP, Cliff, right, has an outreach in Chicago also?
Informally.
Okay, right. So, but the contact with BJ and her the people she's in contact with that are doing, it's called a design and development launching pilot, DDLP, and it's active and operating in Chicago.
Hi, my name is Adora, and I wanted to ask you, as a student, I am really bad at math.
No, you're not.
And I believe I've failed math about 2 times already. And I would like to know how you would deal with these types of situations with people who like for example, I just sit and I just see all those numbers and I just go, how would you deal with those students trying to encourage them that maybe it's not that hard, giving them a reason to do it?
So you are a teacher?
No, I'm a student.
You're a student, okay. And you're talking about your own access to math.
Yes.
Yes. And where are you? Where are you located?
I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm representing the Tequila.
You're living in Puerto Rico?
Yes.
Okay. So, so I think we do have on our staff, Bill Crombie, whose partner is from Puerto Rico. And she does expeditionary learning at a high school in Boston. So I think what to do, Cliff, is to put the young lady in touch with Bill and his partner, and they could help you think through this problem for yourself, right? The thing that we do is we don't start with numbers, right? We start with experience, right? So math comes from our experience on this planet. And so it's taking that experience and figuring out, well, in that experience, what are the mathematical concepts and how do we reach them and how do we work with them? And the problem with math is that the fundamental concepts that you start off with are too obvious to pay attention to, right? They're just so obvious, nobody pays attention to, right? And so how do you get students who are entering into their math education to pay attention to these concepts? So we have a curricular process that helps students do this. And one feature of it is a feature of language. The idea that the language we speak, the ordinary language that everybody speaks, say in this case, the ordinary English, is not the language where the symbols of math get translated from. There is another language that nobody speaks. I learned about it when I was in graduate school in the 1950s. And the professor there, Willard Van Orman Quine, called it a regimented language. And he was investigating mathematical logic and how it got off the ground. And what he said was that elementary arithmetic elementary set theory, elementary logic, get off the ground by the regimentation of ordinary discourse. And when you regiment ordinary discourse, you get a language that nobody speaks, but it's the language that gets translated into all of the symbolic representations of math and science. So the Algebra Project in particular has made great effort wherever possible to get young people and their teachers to understand how to negotiate these two languages around particular math concepts, right? And so it's in some sense, it's once you see it, it's clear. If you don't see it, it's not there at all, right? You just don't see what's going on, right? So anyway, I think that's one way. I don't know if you're up to it, but we can certainly put you in touch with Bill and his partner.
That would be great.
Hi, my name is Jerry Mofty.
Yeah, I didn't catch your name.
Jerry Mofty.
Larry?
Yeah, I'm a youth from Minnesota.
From where?
Minnesota, St. Paul.
Minnesota, okay.
And my question for you is, I kind of freeze up and get nervous when I take a standardized test. So my question is, how do I prepare myself mentally and academically?
What year are you in?
What was the question? I'm a junior. We take ACTs next week also.
Okay, all right. So, so one thing, do you know how long you're allowed to take the test?
Test. I believe we're given an hour for each test.
Just an hour?
Yeah.
And are you allowed any technology assistance, or is it just paper and pencil?
No, it's just paper and pencil.
It's paper. Yeah. And you've been to practice sessions?
Yeah, one this year.
Yeah. So one of the problems, of course, then, is that there's a whole science of taking these tests because the people who make them, right, the psychometricians, have a kind of standard process for making the tests. And so people who pay a lot of money to get ready for the test, these test prep people, they don't really focus so much on the content. They focus on how the test is constructed and how you negotiate and in some sense outwit the test makers by understanding how they construct these multiple choice tests. Is that mostly, is the whole test multiple choice? That's okay.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So have you been, I mean, does your school offer any, does it offer some kind of insight into how these tests are constructed?
No, it does not.
It doesn't. So I don't know. This is a problem, folks, for because people who have money and who want to make sure that their kids do well on these tests pay money to have their kids learn how to take these tests, right? And you're not talking about content so much as you're talking about understanding how these tests are structured, and so therefore understanding with the content you have mastered how to make sure that it, you know, works for you when taking these tests. So you need help. You need somebody who can help you. You need to scrape together, I don't know how much it costs up there, to look at how these tests are actually constructed. Does anyone, I've forgotten the name of the company, the national company, which does this?
Kaplan.
Not Kaplan.
Princeton Review.
Princeton Review.
They have some
There's-
stuff.
There's something based in California also. But anyway, so a little research can uncover the people who are doing this, but that's kind of preparation. But unfortunately, that's where the problem is. How are you actually doing in class with the subject matters?
I'm pretty good.
You're pretty good. Where do you want to go when you leave high school? You know what you want to do next?
Not yet.
Not yet. So I don't know. I don't know how you guys there, Cliff and Albert, if you have any, you guys took these tests?
So I think this could lead into kind of helping us. So in every email Bob sends at the end, he has a signature KOP. It's key form. And I take it as a continuing step. There is work to be done. We have to push to make sure that our work gets done. And the vehicle that can help this push is the Alliance. So me and Albert wanted to end this one off, Bob, just to wrap it all up, is how can we get these fine people in this room connected the best way that they should be connected to even the spirit of the work of the National Alliance. You heard me, right, Bob?
Yeah.
That was a serious. That was a question.
That was a question?
Yeah.
I didn't hear the question in it.
No,
Yeah.
tell him it's a question.
Oh, you have a question?
No, he said, he asked you, is that a question?
Oh, yeah, he came. Yeah, that was a question. How should this group of people best be fitted in with the Alliance? How can we get connected?
To the Alliance, yes.
Yeah.
So anyone who's interested in what the Alliance does and how it's going about doing it should write their names down, and we can shoot you an email which will contain sort of an encapsulated description of, you know, the alliance and where it's at. Basically, we are trying to grow an alliance, right? And the difficulty, of course, is when you want to organize and grow something and you don't have any money, right? Then you have to get agreement, right? You have to get a consensus about what it is that you're trying to do. And so we have an initial consensus that what the Alliance is focused on is a math literacy platform for the bottom quartile appropriate for the 21st century, right? So we're focused on the kids at the bottom, the same idea that at the beginning in that video, that it wasn't radical to just do voter registration per se, right? It was radical to make sure that the sharecroppers got the right to vote. And it turned out that in order for them to get the right to vote, the actual national party structure had to open itself up, right? So we have no idea what will have to happen in the country in order for the kids at the bottom to get the literacies they need for the 21st century, without which they are headed, sure as we speak, for the criminal justice system, right? You know, the sharecroppers we worked with in the 60s in Mississippi were the serfs of the industrial age. We are growing serfs of the information age, but they are not locked away on plantations. They are in the middle of our urban areas, and it won't be pretty. When this thing metastasizes, the whole issue that large swaths of the population have no function in our society and no economic access, right? So this is a real existential problem for us. And so we're focused on that small piece of the problem as a way to get into it. And we have managed to get out a value statement on which we, people who are part of the Alliance, have agreed. So we have a consensus about certain things that we value. And it was interesting when we went to amend it, we didn't quite get agreement about the nature of an amendment to this, which is dealing with the question, can all of the kids at the bottom get this math literacy, or 90%, right? What should we say in our value statement about that? So we're still talking about that issue. But what has happened because of the Alliance is that there's important work going on at the ground in school districts and in schools, right? And there are important ways in which people who are doing that work are beginning to be in touch with each other. And also as a result of the Alliance, but we're in a position now to actually at least have a conversation about the national question, right? And we will see, there is a National Math Festival that is held in Washington by MSRI, the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, every other year. It will be held in May of 2019. And we are going to try to use that time to have some public event at which we try to get at least to launch a national conversation about these issues. So give us your name if you're interested. We'd be glad to get in touch with you.
Hi, Bob. Pat, we appreciate it. Can't thank you enough, man.
All right. Thanks, everybody. All right, if I leave. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, we're about to transition into our next session. Martin wanted to say a few things leading to just a quick brief amendment.
It's not leading into the next. No, many of you know this organization, this group started in the fight against standardized testing. And it's an aspect of my life I'm on. I've spent my adult life fighting standardized testing. And so I'm disheartened to know how much the conversation was still about it. But it is. So a couple of quick things factually. If you're interested in the alternatives, the network in New York that Bob mentioned, that's the New York Performance Standards Consortium. It's on the web at performanceassessment.org. Some 45 rough high schools that don't administer the state exams to graduate from high school. And Ann Cook, the head of the director, is a long time out part of North Dakota. The second thing I would say is fair test.